Speaker.
I acknowledge the honourable member, Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. As my colleague, the Honourable David Cunliffe mentioned, Labor will be supporting this bill through to Select Committee. We think there are some very good aspects of this bill, and we look forward to further discussions with officials and with submitters and around the table. One of the reasons and one of the big parts of this bill is to do with making tax easier. Now, what this is a plan by the IRD to actually make tax easier. Sounds like a good idea, and Labor is supportive and has always been supportive of any legislation that makes it easier to pay one's tax or makes it easier for taxpayers to comply. It was a good paper, and we think the IRD is making some great progress in this area. And as mentioned, I look forward to dialogue with the IRD, with submitters and the rest of my colleagues when this comes to Select Committee. But, Mr Speaker, there are some points that I would like to make very briefly. As my colleague mentioned, one of the things that this bill does is it actually sets the tax rate for the next tax year. Now, we are one of the very few countries in the OECD that has actually cut tax rates for the very wealthy. And, Mr Speaker, if I may give you an example, with the National Party tax cuts, what we saw is those who had a declared income of over $1 million receiving around $1,000 a week extra in the hand. Mr Speaker, the IRD tell me there's about 700 New Zealanders that have a declarable income of over $1 million. Now, if they earn $1 million, they received about $1,000 a week extra. That's $1,000 a week extra. Now, Mr Speaker, someone on the medium wage in Napier received about $11 a week extra. Now, the question I ask and the question that people ask me is that fair? Quite simply, Mr Speaker, it isn't. And one of the reasons it isn't fair, well, apart from the obvious, is these tax cuts were actually paid for by an increase in GST. Now, this bill deals with GST matters, and again, anything that sort of makes the system or improves the integrity of the system, we're all for. But, Mr Speaker, the thing that I have a slight problem with is the then Leader of the Opposition, Mr John Key, stood in front of New Zealanders, looked into the camera and said, National will not increase GST. And yet one of the first things Mr Key did was he increased GST from 12.5% to 15%. And the money that the government collected from that increase in GST went to fund those $1,000 a week tax cuts for those men and women who are earning over $1 million. I mean, Paul Reynolds, I know, who's one of the highest paid gentlemen in this country, he earned $4,500 a week extra in the hand. Oh, you just got to ask, is that fair? And we don't think that is fair at all, Mr Speaker. The other thing that this bill deals with is working for families and KiwiSaver. Now, this government also went into the 2008 election, Mr Speaker, and told New Zealanders that they would not cut KiwiSaver. And yet this last budget cut KiwiSaver, Mr Speaker. This cut KiwiSaver. And there were many people around the country who said, we had a contract with the government in the form of KiwiSaver, and the government reneged when it made cuts to every person's KiwiSaver account. Another aspect of this bill, Mr Speaker, is working for families. Now, Mr Speaker, let me give you one example. I come from Hawke's Bay. Working for families contributes about $120 million into the Hawke's Bay economy. At the moment, in the provinces, things are a little bit tough. People are working very hard, but things are tough. The cost of living is going through the roof, and the $11 a week that someone on the median wage earns is simply not covering it. So when the government makes cuts to working for families, it affects the whole regional economy. Because, Mr Speaker, the people that are on working for families are there because they need the money to raise a family. They spend the money in the local economy, it creates jobs, it creates demand, and it helps those workers who are working in the Hawke's Bay area. Making cuts to that scheme was detrimental to the whole Hawke's Bay, in fact, the whole New Zealand economy. And in fact, Mr Speaker, someone said to me, why does Mr Key hate New Zealanders who are struggling hard to get ahead? Why does Mr Key hate New Zealanders who are struggling hard to get ahead? And Mr Speaker, I am seeing a number of people coming into my office in Napier, my office based in Napier, who are actually working very hard. These are full-time workers, but they are having to make a choice about whether they pay the rent or the mortgage, whether they pay for food, whether they put petrol in the car, pay for electricity, or put clothes on their kids' backs. They are having to make that choice, Mr Speaker. And I wonder if this is the sort of country, Mr Speaker, that New Zealanders believe New Zealand should be, when people who work very hard are still struggling to make ends meet. Mr Speaker, that's all I'll say on that, but there is one thing I will bring up, and I know, and this is one thing that we'll tease out in the committee in the select committee stage, but it's something that Mr Cunliffe mentioned, and it talks about the tax treatment of unsuccessful software development. And I'm wondering if this is a little bit self-serving. The key feature here is the amendment allows a deduction when a person, or a company I assume, incurs expenditure on developing software for use in their business and the development of this software is abandoned. Now, Mr Speaker, earlier on this year, the IRD abandoned a software project around their student loan scheme. The cost of that to the IRD and the taxpayer was about $20 million. There was $20 million of taxpayer money that went into a scheme that had the plug pulled out from it. And I'm wondering if this is slightly self-serving. We're all for economic development, we're all for businesses getting ahead, and there is no doubt about it that increasing productivity is the only way forward for this country. And so software systems help that. But, when everyone knows actually that the IRD wrote off $20 million, I just sort of wonder if this is slightly self-serving. On that note, Mr Speaker, as mentioned, we will be supporting this bill to the Select Committee, but there are many conversations that have to be had before we support this bill all the way through. Thank you very much.
Good contribution from the next MP.
I recognise the Honourable Member, Dr.